Kelson had a hidden pint of corn whiskey in a flour bin, but I knew where it was hidden. He'd been on a bender all day, and I came to take him home. He was too drunk to drive.
Hey, baby. Baby, come over here and give me some sugars. Come on, baby.
He was making threats to me and tried to force me to go to bed with him.
You don't come over here right now, I won't be here next week, crazy old woman.
I decided I'd teach him, and I did. I went to the flour bin and found the pint fruit jar with the whiskey, and I added the poison. I poisoned his rot gut whiskey.
Welcome back to the Coroner's Report. My name is Steve Navoychek. I'm a retired coroner of two of the largest counties in the state of Arkansas, and I also served as the director of the state crime lab. These days, I'm retired, and I work mostly as a chauffeur for my dog, Butter. I like to review old cases with my partner, Tracy Carrington. This time around, we're going back, way back in time to look at one of the most prolific yet almost forgotten female serial killers in the United States, Nannie Doss.
Before we dive in, I wanted to let you know actors will be playing most of the parts in this podcast because everyone involved has passed away. But we did manage to pull in some good experts, and we tracked down Nannie's great-granddaughter, who's never really spoken to the press about her family. We also spent time pulling all the records we could find, from the courthouse to the police departments in multiple states, looking for the trail of Nannie Doss.
She was responsible for killing 4 husbands between the years 1945 and 1954, but that's not the entire list. She killed many, many more people. Statistically, female serial killers are extremely rare. Studies between 1990 and 2016 found only 6.5% of known serial killers were women, but those were only the known killers.
Serial killing women might be stealthier, Steve.
Exactly. Black widows like Nannie Doss fall into their own special category. They use manipulation to lure in their prey. They are intelligent and organized. They plot and they plan. Oftentimes, their instrument of choice is poison, and typically there's a profit motive. Of course, all this happened before we knew much about serial killers, because Nannie's killing spree was discovered in the mid-1950s.
You know, Steve, in the 1950s, it seems like it was an idyllic time to some, but many have forgotten the horrors that happened that decade. You've got the Cutler family murder that made famous by Truman Capote in his book In Cold Blood, the ghastly murder of Emmett Till, and then you have Nannie Doss, who poisoned 4 of her 5 husbands with arsenic and may have killed many, many more family members.
So 4 out of 5 husbands would not recommend marrying her, right?
Oh, you're right. Only her very first husband managed to escape the rat poison.
Nancy Nannie Hazel was born in Alabama in 1905. It would take almost 50 years for her story to come to light in Tulsa, Oklahoma, after she killed her 5th and final husband. Her childhood seems pretty typical. Farm life in Alabama in the late 1800s and early 1900s wasn't all that fun or profitable. Nannie was quoted in the paper recounting her childhood.
We lived on a farm near Blue Mountain, Alabama, not too far from Anniston. I was the second child in a family of 5. 4 were daughters, and the youngest was a son. From the time I was a little girl, I had to work in the fields. My mother was an angel, and I always liked her. I got along all right with my father until he left home and stayed away 21 years. Oh, we'd see him now and then, but he never came back. He was a starter. He'd put in a crop, and then halfway through the season, he'd go off, and someone would have to finish it. We worked other people's land and got half the crop. We didn't have very much. It was hard to make ends meet.
Now, some researchers in this story think that Nannie was born years before, but if you study the census records, you'll learn that Hazel had 2 other children who died the first few years of their life. One baby's name is lost to history, but in 1900, there was a baby on the census named Nannie. This was not the Nannie that we're talking about, but an older sister. We know from the 1910 census that her mother had given birth to 5 children and only 3 were alive. Nancy and the nickname Nannie were family names and carried down through the family tree. So naming a child after a dead sibling was often done. I just don't think I could do that.
I think it's bad mojo.
That's some bad mojo or juju or hoodoo or whatever.
Times were tough, and the more babies you had, the more likely you were to have a few of them live to adulthood. Nannie's Uncle Mac was quoted in the papers talking about how she was raised.
Her parents are Jim and Lou Hazel. Both were born here in Calhoun County and were sharecroppers. Nannie and her sisters were born on the farm, and small children they hoed cotton and corn. Did the works usually assigned to bigger kids. To make ends meet, old Jim Hazel got a hold of a dray wagon and hauled baggage to and from old Southern Railroad station, a job which paid him 25 cents a trunk.
We can see from the old records that the family wasn't financially secure. Nannie's father worked various jobs from mining ore to working in the mills to moving baggage for the railroad. All very tough jobs.
Family moved from house to house. Once Jim found an abandoned railroad car and turned it into a home. Nannie lived there for many months, and the rail yards were her playground. When she's 7, she started grammar school. I don't recall anything unusual about her early days at the mill school. By the time she's about 10, the family rented a farm not far from Jacksonville, Alabama.
Throughout this story, Nannie sings her mother's praises, but she wasn't too fond of her father.
It was my mother who held the family together. We never had much money. I got through about the 5th grade and then had to leave school to help with the farm work. I'd get down on my knees and crawl anywhere for my mother. I love my mother, but I have to admit I didn't have too much love for my father. He was mean to me. He wouldn't let us do anything. He was awful strict. He wouldn't let us go to shows, to parties, or to go out with the boys. And sometimes there wasn't much to eat.
There's no way of knowing just how difficult their lives really were back then, because Nannie loved a good story.
I was 9 years old and in a buggy which overturned when it was hit by a train. It was a terrible train accident, and it cracked my head open. I'll never forget crawling out from under it and running to my father, who was with me. I've had headaches all the time, have had for years. Sometimes I don't sleep over 2 or 3 hours a night. Sometimes I think I might be thinking crooked.
Oh, I'm fairly certain her thinking was pretty crooked.
Oh, you're saying you wouldn't drink what she was serving?
Nope, not on your life, sister. And this train story, well, it's hard to prove or disprove, but this was the only direct quote from Nannie about the accident.
The story of the train accident changes a lot throughout time. Sometimes she was on the train, sometimes she was in a buggy, sometimes it was a huge train accident where people died, and sometimes she just hit the seat in front of her. Dr. George McCoy Jr., a psychologist at Eastern Oklahoma State Hospital, asked Nannie about the accident.
Nannie was in a wagon which was struck by a switch engine when she was 7. There were no discernible injury at the time, but she complained of severe headaches and eye trouble periodically since.
Now, I have my doubts on if this accident ever really happened, or if it did, how that may or may not have affected her later in life. So we asked Dr. Randy Hill. He's a family practice doctor with 28 years of experience in Arkansas.
Closed head injuries can cause personality changes. In my experience, everybody's heard about Freud. He talks about the id and the ego and the superego. And the theory being that your ego is your inner core and your thought processes that you just really want to express, whereas your ego or your superego will suppress those thoughts. For instance, if you thought my shirt was ugly, you wouldn't run up to me and say, "Hey, Randy, that's a butt ugly shirt," because your ego or superego would suppress that. And people that have closed head injuries, sometimes they lose that impulse control. And they tend to be a lot more impulsive in how they act. Sometimes they kind of like lose that filter a little bit. Sometimes they have to put on seizure medicines and other things to treat that. But it's not always. That doesn't always occur, but there is an instance where that can occur.
But could a closed head injury turn someone into a prolific serial killer? Not just a personality change, but could it turn them into a monster manifesting 10, 20, or 40 years later?
People I'm aware of that have it, we're talking like people in a coma, really bad concussive injuries that I've seen. Certainly not anything to the degree that it affect her personality, I wouldn't think. It should have been pretty quick after she had that incident. I think that's kind of not medically credible.
Of course, it's hard to know today just how impaired or unimpaired Nannie was after this accident, or if the accident even occurred, because Nannie sure did like her stories.
To escape the reality of farm life, Nannie developed a love for romance magazines that she got from her mother.
These were the soap operas of the day. Nannie told investigators later that she only completed the 5th grade, but she was listed as a 15-year-old on the 1920 census and attending school, and she could read and write. There were a lot of girls in her generation that could not read and write, so she did have some education.
You have to remember, Blue Mountain, Alabama might sound just like a wide spot in the road, but it was a few miles away from downtown Anniston. In fact, today there is no Blue Mountain. It was annexed into Anniston years ago.
So there were lots of jobs, and throughout her childhood, Nannie's extended family members worked in the textile mills. Factory work was more stable than farm life, so as soon as she was old enough, Nannie went to work at the linen thread factory.
There's no clear indication of violence in her childhood home, but there was a mention of an incident involving Nannie's father, Jim Hazel, in the newspaper of the time.
Monroe Gables is in the county jail, and his father-in-law, Jim Hazel, is seriously cut at his home in Blue Mountain as the aftermath of the family row there Friday. The injured man's wife and daughter both describing the fight Saturday morning in the sheriff's office in a way that indicates that Gables fought his father-in-law in self-defense. Bad feeling is said to have existed between the two men for several weeks and culminated Friday in a fierce fight between the two men. Hazel is said by his wife and daughter to have attacked Gables in the hallway of his home after both doors had been fastened, Gables cutting his way through the door and reaching the outside.
Monroe Gables was married to Nannie's older sister. That marriage would end shortly after this incident, and Monroe was later charged with failure to pay child support to his ex-wife and kids, so that may be the reason there was a fight at the house.
So with that incident, we can't really judge if Jim Hazel was violent toward his family or simply protecting them.
Oh, that's right. There was really no way to know. There are some podcasts and articles out there that discuss that she was a victim of sexual abuse as a child, but I found no record indicating that sort of abuse, and her great-granddaughter doesn't believe that happened either. Then again, it would have been unusual for it to be reported back then. If a girl was sexually abused, that would have just been a family secret, because then the girl, if it had been known, would have been seen as damaged goods.
Soon, Nannie's dream of romance would come true on the factory floor at the mill.
I met my first husband, Charlie, when we were working at a cotton mill. I was 16 when we got married in 1921. I only knowed Charlie about 4 or 5 months. He had no family, only a mother who was unwed and who had taken over my life completely when we were married. She never seen anything wrong with what she done, but she would take spells. She would not let my own mother stay all night.
This isn't setting up to be a marriage made in paradise. There are reports that Nannie started drinking and smoking heavily to deal with her live-in mother-in-law.
Her first and only surviving husband, out of 5, had a lot to say to the press. His name was Charlie Braggs, and man, what a story he had to tell.
She was a pretty girl, good built and a lot of fun. I was 19 and I really wanted to go work on the railroad, and a friend told me the railroad might be more likely to hire me if I was married, so I proposed to Nannie on Saturday in early 1921. We rented a horse and buggy and drove to the courthouse. I got the license, and the justice of the peace married us.
My father was the one who thought Charlie Braggs was such a fine one. It was before my father left home.
Got along fine the first couple of years. We were living in a rented cottage along Mill Road. She used to make accusations at me, but since I worked on the railroad, I could prove where I was every minute. In 1923, our first baby Gertrude was born. Zelma followed less than a year later. We had one baby that died in childbirth, and Gertrude and Zelma were about 1.5 when they both died unexpectedly about a month apart. Doctors thought they both died of food poisoning.
We got along pretty well for married life, but Charlie started running around, going off and staying overnight. We were divorced in 1928.
Our marriage started off pretty well, but after a couple of years, Nannie started doing strange things. She started going off. She's going to her folks or off with someone, and I'd have to get her back.
You know, back then in the 1920s, so many babies died awful deaths and no one really thought anything about it. You and I have discussed the case I worked in North Little Rock back in the 80s where a young mother had 5 babies die. Her name was Deborah Tuggle, and come to find out she was smothering those babies. If not for luck and one eagle-eyed, nerdy doctor, we would have never caught on. So I can see how easy it would be for murder to happen, and no one thinks a thing of it.
It's like we talked about in that case. It's seeing those patterns. That's what got Deborah Tuggle caught. Patterns. Today we know so much more about postpartum depression and what effect that can have on young mothers, but it still goes all the way back to patterns. Dr. Randy Hill explains why he might have been suspicious seeing 2 dead babies within a month, both dying of gastric distress.
You can see one child, maybe food poisoning, maybe some form of colic back in the day, maybe an occult appendicitis, maybe they had a volvulus, or, now it could be treatable, wasn't back in the day. But I think, too, that's just really suspect, in my opinion.
Nannie's husband and the father of the dead babies, Charlie Braggs, was suspicious.
I was away at the time working for the railroad. Some of the neighbors said there was something funny about the way they died because they turned black so quick.
Turning black? That's an interesting comment.
That's above my pay grade. I learned a long time ago to leave the doctoring to doctors. That's why we called in Dr. Randy Hill.
You get blue, kind of your fingers and all that kind of stuff gets kind of bluish as you get kind of progress with it. Oxygen. The main issue is the GI stuff.
Folks were just much closer to death back then, and babies died all the time. Nannie would have given birth to 5 babies in 8 years. I can see where postpartum depression might have played a role, but this was decades before those terms even came around. I asked Dr. Hill what death by arsenic might be like.
It's not going to be, fetch me the fainting couch and the smelling salts kind of situation now. It's a bad intestinal disease, nausea, vomiting, maybe some neuropathy over time, because it affects your central nervous system to some degree. The main issue is going to be a GI component to it.
It just sounds brutal. It's hard to imagine that a mother could watch her children suffer like that, and it makes me wonder how she could be that cruel. Charlie Braggs remembers her temper.
She was high-tempered and was right mean. She made like she was a church woman when we got married, and some of my folks thought she was, but I found out pretty soon she was no more Christian than if she'd never heard the Bible preached. Told my mama that.
There is an unnamed family member quoted in the paper saying that Nannie spent a lot of time at missionary meetings and always was baking cakes for the meetings.
Would you like a little Jesus with your arsenic, Steve?
No, thank you. There's no indication at that time of what was to come. But by the 1950s, when all the murders come to light, Charlie Bragg says he was scared of Nannie and left pretty quickly after the babies died. But it was a few years before he left and filed for divorce.
I was scared to death, and so were all my relatives. She was a peculiar woman. She didn't think straight and couldn't sit still for 5 minutes. Some of my folks tried to warn me about her. And when she got mad, I wouldn't eat nothing she fixed or drink nothing around the house.
That's a hell of a way to live, isn't it?
I don't think I want to eat what Nannie was serving, but I'm really not sure that Charlie's accounting 30 years later was all that accurate.
About 8 years of this was enough. I decided it was all off when she came to our house. I called her daddy and said for him to come get one of the girls. I decided to keep Florine, the oldest. Her daddy came and got the other. I got divorced in Gapstown.
They divorced in 1928. Nannie moved back in with her parents, who were now living in Anniston, and her father was working as a foundryman, most likely at the Anniston Pipe Foundry.
That was a huge step up from the farm, and a good job.
She was quick-tempered. Her whole family is like that. Sometimes she would get mad for a reason, and sometimes it seemed not. She'd pout and then go off for days, weeks, often with other men. One of those men she ran off with was Frank Harrelson of Jacksonville, Alabama, her second husband and the first one on the list that she admitted to poisoning. She married him after we were divorced in 1928. Frank Harrelson was not mean, hard to get along with otherwise.
Frank Harrelson? I loved him better than my other husbands. He was my favorite. I had known him since we were kids. I never had dated him before I left Charlie. We married in Jacksonville, Alabama.
Nannie's Uncle Mac remembered husband number 2, Frank Harrelson, fondly.
Frank Harrelson met Nannie and her family when they were on the farm in Jacksonville. He was 3 years older than Nannie. He'd ended up being her second husband and the first of the 4 husbands that she poisoned.
Judd Harrelson was Frank Harrelson's younger brother.
Them Hazel kids and us used to play games together, and Frank took a liking to Nannie. I didn't. She had a mean streak in her. I never had much of a like for her. I could care less about Nannie. There was something about her I just disliked. She could never look you straight in the eye. When she's being friendly, you got the idea it was all just a farce.
The newlyweds moved to Cedartown, Georgia with Nannie and one of her 2 daughters. During the investigation into Harrelson's death, the Calhoun County, Alabama sheriff discovered Nannie wasn't that attentive of a mother.
Harrelson and Mrs. Doss left Cedartown one night and abandoned the child in a vacant house. Neighbors found the child cold and hungry and called Braggs in Blue Mountain. He went to Georgia and picked up his daughter and raised her.
There were several other signs of issues during the marriage. By 1939, Frank was serving a short term in jail for public drunkenness.
I don't know about you, but living with Nannie would probably drive the Pope to drink.
I'm not real sure the Pope would stay in the same room with Nannie, Steve. It's about this same time period when Nannie's father also goes to jail. He served 6 weeks in a jail for adultery, and for the most part, he'd already left the family. I know this is really starting to sound like a really bad country music song.
All it needs is a dog. Poor Frank, I have a feeling this isn't going to end well for him, but Nannie sure did love him.
Well, until she didn't.
Life with Frank wasn't good. He drank and beat me. He was a drunkard, and everybody knew it. He was an awful drunkard. He never mistreated me too bad, although he used to slap me around when he was drunk, but that's the way of a drunk man.
There were indications that he was a drinker. Calhoun County, Alabama Sheriff Pate later would investigate Harrelson's death. Pate also was quoted in the paper saying that Frank Harrelson was inclined to touch alcohol more than others.
But even with the alcohol, Nannie and Frank were married for 16 years. Then tragedy struck. Nannie's daughter, Melvina, gave birth in February of 1945. Nannie's great-granddaughter, Nicole, today recounts the story that she always heard.
My mother had flat told us our whole lives that when Melvina had the baby, that she was in and out of the anesthetic, and she could have swore that she saw Nannie take a hat pin from her hat and stick it in the top of the baby's head, and then passed out again, and then come to her child dead.
When Melvina asked her husband and sister about the birth of her little girl, they both said that Nannie came out of the room and told them that the baby had died. Both noticed that she was holding a hat pin in her hands, but there was never a ruling on the cause of death.
I tried to locate a death certificate on this child, which should be in the Alabama archives, but there's no death listed.
There's no way to even know if this child was ever born or if this is just family lore. But having a family member retell the same story that we found in the newspapers sure makes it more credible.
However, Melvina had an older child.
The little boy's name was Robert Lee Higgins. He was just about 2 years old, and he was the apple of his step-grandfather's eye. Frank's brother Robert was about 2 years old when he died. Frank Harrelson's brother, Judd, told the press he thought he knew why.
I believe she's jealous of that child, too. I actually believe she was jealous of her husband's brothers and sisters, too.
Melvina was dating a soldier that Nannie didn't approve of, and that started an argument. Melvina left the house, but left Robert in the care of Nannie.
All I know is that I left on a Saturday and the boy was fine. Mother was with him. When I returned the next Saturday, he was in a box, dead.
According to Melvina, Robert died the same way as the others. The others were the two little girls, Zelma and Gertrude, that were Melvina's older sisters, who died 20 years earlier. Judd Harrelson had even more to say to the investigators.
When little Robert Lee died in 1945, I was standing there beside my brother at the gravesite, and Frank turned to me and he said, "I'll be next." When I asked him to explain, he said, "Oh, nothing. My troubles are my troubles, and yours are yours."
Frank's troubles were just beginning. Nannie and Frank were there when Robert was buried, but Frank wouldn't live much longer. Just 2 months later, Frank went out alone with his friends to celebrate the end of World War II. Nannie was not pleased.
Frank Harrelson had a hidden pint of corn whiskey in a flour bin, but I knew where it was hidden. He'd been on a bender all day, and I came to take him home. He was too drunk to drive. He was making threats to me and tried to force me to go to bed with him. He told me if I didn't come to bed with him right then, he would be here next week. I decided I'd teach him, and I did. I went to the flour bin and found the pint fruit jar with the whiskey, and I added the poison. I poisoned his rot-gut whiskey.
That whiskey alone could kill you. Nannie was sort of like Carrie Nations. She really had a problem with men who drank, and a bigger problem finding men who didn't drink. Dr. McCoy from Eastern Oklahoma State Hospital learned a bit more in his evaluation of Nannie.
Nannie grew to be very ambivalent in her feelings toward the second husband, alternately hating and loving him. In an impulsive outburst, she probably poisoned him after having lived with him for about 16 years.
I wanted to kill him, but I decided I should do something for him to make up for it. So when he got sick, I called the doctor to treat him. He was sick for a week before he died. I told him to pump his stomach out and get rid of the whiskey, and he would be all right. He told me when he was sick that he would never touch another drop.
Poor Frank died in the arms of his killer.
He drank all the time and wasn't much of a loss. He wasn't a Christian. And though I don't claim to be a devout Methodist, I didn't like his drinking. I lived through 15 years of Frank Harrelson's weekend drinking.
Now, Nannie may not have loved Frank, but Nannie sure did love a good funeral. I guess you could say she put the fun in funeral, and she loved funeralizing more than anybody that most people had ever seen.
She was in the spotlight as the somewhat grieving widow. She even bought a double burial plot with a headstone inscribed with Frank's name and her name. The empty grave next to Frank's and the headstone with Nannie's name on it still stand today in an Alabama cemetery. It reads, "God be with you until we meet again." Nearby stands the headstone for her grandson, Robert Lee Higgins. It's inscribed, "Darling, we miss thee."
Frank Harrelson's family was suspicious, but there was no real evidence. But Nannie was awfully charming.
Nannie was a good, kind soul. She was gentle. She worked for us on and off for 8 years, and there was never a better woman.
Now, interestingly enough, there was a movie that came out right before she poisoned poor Frank Harrelson. Do you remember Arsenic and Old Lace? It was the rom-com of the day, starring Cary Grant.
I remember that play well. I was cast in it back in high school, and I never dreamed I'd be talking about it today.
I imagine. The movie premiered in September of 1944, and Frank Harrelson died in 1945. Frank would be the first person we know of for certain that died from arsenic poisoning.
So you're thinking maybe Nannie saw the movie and decided to start killing?
No, I think she just discovered a more effective way of killing, Steve.
Or she sat through that movie just laughing to herself, knowing that she used that same poison.
I can see that happening too, but she did say she only started poisoning in 1945 with Harrelson. Either way, the bodies would start piling up. Enter husband number 3, Arlie Lanning.
I met Arlie Lanning in Alabama, but I just don't recall all the circumstances of how we met. I married him in South Carolina, and then we went to Lexington, North Carolina to live.
It's interesting to me that Nannie can't seem to remember where she met Arlie Lanning.
She also said they got married in South Carolina, but forgot the date. By the way, they were never married in South Carolina or anywhere else for that matter.
Nannie didn't say a lot about Arlie in the papers.
They were together for about 5 years. But I guess after a while, you kill one husband and then they just kind of all run together.
Speaking from experience?
I cannot confirm nor deny, Steve.
Ha, likely story. The Lanning marriage appeared to be as unstable as all the rest of Nannie's marriages.
Arlie brought a group of people to the house one night, and the police came to the house and took them to jail.
Nannie's first husband, Charlie, had something to say about that story.
That story isn't true. Our daughter Florine is married to Lanning's nephew, Homer Lanning. Those people she's talking about were me and my family. All that happened was that the police heard there were strangers in the house, which was out in the country by itself, and went out to see who it was. Nannie wrote us a terrible letter after that, but there was no more calm, steady man in the world than Arlie Lanning. He never ran after other women.
I poisoned Arlie in Lexington, North Carolina in 1952 because he was popular with the ladies. I was sorry I gave him rat poison. He was a pretty good husband.
I guess it really didn't matter. Old widow Nannie was burying yet another husband.
This time around, there was a little life insurance policy. Harry Steege, the Tulsa police captain, learned more about Lanning's death during his investigation.
Arlie Lanning, husband number 3, left a small insurance policy to his wife, but willed his farm home to his sister. The house burned down mysteriously shortly after his death. The insurance company later refused to pay benefits after they found out Nannie had moved some of her personal furniture from the house the day of the fire.
So Nannie came out of the funeral with a little bit of money, and according to her first husband, Charlie Braggs, she invested it.
After Ollie's death, Nannie used the insurance money to open a rooming house in Lexington, North Carolina. Once she got a hold of any money, she really hung on to it. One time her 2 daughters went up there and she had them arrested. Never did get the whole story of what went on there.
I'm not sure anyone ever got the whole story about Nannie. At Arlie's funeral, Nannie said she was finished with romance because the good Lord had taken away 2 of her husbands.
Hallelujah, sister.
Funny how that happened. Killing just seemed to be easy for her, and the deaths started coming faster and faster. Good old Charlie Bragg's husband number 1 lived to see the deaths of all the other husbands. This concludes part 1 of this episode of the Coroner's Report, Nannie Doss, the Self-Made Widow. Stick around, there's a lot more to this story. If you like our content, please remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends. And if you have questions, please reach out to us on our website at coronersreport.net or on any social media platform at The Coroner's Report. Special thanks to Nannie's great-granddaughter, Nicole Young, and Dr. Randy Hill for their insight and memories. Thanks go out also to voice actors J.D. West, Amy Oliver Barnes, Chris Schaefer, Alan Prather, Sean Davis, and Savvy Valentine. Copyright 2025 Aussie Grove Media Group, LLC.